South Africa is battling to find the middle ground between its interests in the West and the East. We speak to Ronan Wordsworth of Geopolitical Futures, who has just written a paper on South Africa's difficult balancing act. Welcome, Ronan.
Thanks very much for having me, Chris.
Please tell us how South Africa can find a workable middle ground externally first.
Yeah, so if we look at the South African external posture over the last, say, 12 months, and since the start of Russia's war in Ukraine, there's been a lot of pressure put on by the West to say outwardly condemn Russia's actions. But then within South Africa, there's been a perception that the government, the ANC, has moved towards Russia and actually strengthened ties with Russia. And that's evidenced by, say, the US ambassador to South Africa, Ruben Biggerty, who accused South Africa of supplying arms to Russia as arms and ammunition by loading their cargo ship back in February. And there's been other allegations as well. And there's this idea that perhaps South Africa had shifted quite far towards the Russian camp. And as part of that, then we had the US trying to respond to this and trying to say, well, hang on here, we're one of your biggest trade partners. You benefit from the African Growth and Opportunity Act, the AGOA, and as part of that, you are given preferential treatment and access to American markets. And so then the American Senate, some senators have actually said we should reassess whether we want to give South Africa this preferential treatment if they're going to continue to move more towards Russia. And as a direct response to that, I think we see the ANC actually softening their stance towards the West. Now we've seen just 2 weeks ago, a bunch of the ministers. We saw the Minister for Development, the Minister for Economic Development, the Minister for International Relations, and the Minister for the Finance Minister, all head to Washington and then head to other G7 countries on what outwardly would appear to be kind of a quest to explain the South African position and mend some of these ties and stress the importance of the relationship with these G7 countries and maybe bring their stance back more towards the middle ground and the outwardly defined neutrality that they've had from the beginning of the war. So they're going back to their traditional point, which is somewhere between the East and the West, and playing off both camps to basically do what's best for South Africa.
Which other country in Africa has found a way to balance the interest between East and West as best as it can?
I think a good example of a country that's actually really played the balancing act quite well would be Kenya. If we look under President Ruto, just recently in the last month, they've signed a trade agreement with the EU, which gives massive benefit to Kenyan farmers and to Kenya industry, where they'll benefit massively from that. But also they have been very pro-Chinese investment in the country. They've currently developing the single gauge railway project, which is a massive project for Kenya and will stimulate economic growth within the country. And they're doing that with the assistance of the Chinese, and they haven't completely shunned Russia in the past. So they've been reticent and willing to listen to proposals from Russia. But interestingly, if we look at the recent Russia-Africa summit in Moscow, or in St. Petersburg, President Ruto did not himself attend and didn't even send a delegate to the forum, which he was one of only 11 countries, I think, not represented at the forum. But he basically said that the African Union can represent us. We don't need to be going there. Also, I think he recognizes that the message that it can send to other countries by being openly friendly towards Russia. I mean, Ramaphosa obviously went to the forum. He was one of 13 heads of state that went to the forum. But yeah, another 30 countries had representatives, but it was much, much reduced from previous iterations of the forum. And I think that's part of how a lot of these African countries are better able to balance between the East and the West. You don't really want to go all into Russia's camp when the Russian economy is not in a state where it can actually benefit you, where you're much better off playing between China and Europe and the US. You get much more benefit from doing that. And that's what I think Kenya has really excelled recently in their foreign policy towards that balancing.
Which country in BRICS, which South Africa is a member of, has managed to find this balance?
Yeah, so I think BRICS is an interesting conglomeration of countries because it was originally devised as a marketing tool by Goldman Sachs about countries with emerging economies and that should be invested in way back in the mid-2000s. And so politically, we've got Brazil and South Africa, which are kind of not on the periphery, but much further away geographically than the other three countries, where you've got India, China, and Russia, which are obviously the three biggest members of BRICS, economically wise and like geopolitically speaking. And we've got India and China, which are in direct competition with each other. So there's always been this kind of conflict within BRICS itself. China and Russia have obviously been strengthening relations during the war in Ukraine, and India is still happily able to trade with Russia. However, India itself is a great example of how you can work with BRICS and yet still interact with the West. So India, in my opinion, has been strengthening its relations very much with the US over the last 3 years, basically. They're part of the Quad, which is a 4-country grouping which includes the US, Japan, Australia, and India. And this grouping is kind of both a security organization where there's a lot of dialogue, there's been a lot more tangible actions, and actually just started at the end of last week was a joint naval exercise off the coast of Australia between the 4 Quad countries. And secondarily, this also has massive economic benefits for India because now, for instance, Australia is one of the biggest renewable mineral mining countries in the world. For instance, with lithium, which we all know is grown massively in importance. Previously, 99% of Australia's lithium was going to China. Now, as a result of this strengthening of the Quad alliance, there's been a lot more focus on building these industries within India. And so India will actually benefit by building up their own domestic industries, by getting access to Australian resources as part of this grouping, while still remaining a very important member within BRICS.
Well, so it has actually managed that really brilliantly. Is South Africa doing enough to find that balance? Do you think there are obstacles that it will simply not be able to overcome?
I think it wasn't doing enough, definitely. And I think it was maybe internally recognized by ANC that they had the balance wrong, which is why they've started to soften their stance towards the West. They've been less hostile in the rhetoric. And obviously this recent mending operations, if we call it that, between the ministers and the US and other G7 countries, the ANC is kind of in a tricky position at the moment because we face the elections coming up next year. And this is the first realistic opportunity that ANC might not win outright in the elections. Their polling numbers are just hovering around up and 50%, but up and down a few percent. And then they could potentially not outright win the election for the first time since the first democratic elections in 1994. So to do that, they're kind of trying to appeal to different bases. And on either side of them, the second largest party, the DA, are very much pro-Western, pro-industry within South Africa. And they're trying to pull them more towards this side where they see the importance of, say, AGOA with the trade to America and different relations with the UK, with the EU. For instance, I mean, if we look at just the exports within South Africa, 21.5% goes to the EU, 10% goes to the US, 7% goes to the UK. So that already makes up almost half of all exports from South Africa, whereas Russia only accounts for 0.5% of all exports out of South Africa. China's up around 20% as well. So China and the EU are the two biggest bilateral partners. So the DA are much more focused on the future of South African industry, building back the economy. As we know, there's been a lot of internal problems with the power generation and different corruption scandals and things like this. On the other side from the DA, we have EFF, who are pulling ANC in the completely polar opposite direction. We have Malema. He's very much anti-imperialist, pro-Russian rhetoric. The irony, obviously, being that I can't understand how Russia can be seen as an anti-imperialist power with what's going on in Ukraine. But be that as it may, they're much more focused on Pan-Africanism, which is not in itself bad in any way. But to partner with Russia is difficult at the moment. Obviously politically, obviously financially, it doesn't make much sense economically. And so that's the rhetoric that EFF are coming out from. And it's very difficult to see how ANC might be able to win over some of the DA voters, whereas some of the EFF voters might be perhaps easier to win over in the case of election, to push them over that line above 50%, when you've got a lot of the unemployed youth blaming other factions outside the country for the problems within South Africa. Then they can use that potentially. So ANC are kind of caught not only in foreign policy wise trying to balance between the two, but also domestically between the EFF and the ANC, the two biggest EFF and the DA, the two second and third biggest parties within South Africa.
Indeed, and should it find itself with an election result that does not give it an outright majority, it may have to choose a coalition partner between the EFF and the DA, and to find middle ground there. What would it have to do?
That would be difficult, because I think if you look at the EFF's rhetoric, it's much more extreme than DA. So it would make more sense to me for them to appeal to the DA, or to even some of the minor parties, which might have a few percent, which can hold the balance of party. Whereas the EFF are much more radical. They don't even really want to work with ANC at all anyway. They want to bring down the ANC a little bit as well. So they will need to, if they need to work in a coalition, they'll need to find a partner that they can work with. And I don't think EFF would be the right partner for that. So in that sense, then you're automatically looking at trying to soften your stance to the West. You're looking towards the other partners, which could bring about the numbers to get through Parliament, but also then promote the trade, promote the growth of the South African economy, which is desperately needed at the moment. So to me, the middle ground should be much more towards the West than it is at the moment. And in saying that, there's still the BRICS Summit coming up in just a week or two's time. And there's many benefits for the trade and for investment from China and even from other BRICS partners such as Brazil and India. I just think that by focusing too much on Russia, it will really upset the balance of South Africa's economy and trade and foreign policy interests compared to the other BRICS partners.
Talking about the upcoming BRICS Summit, do you think it will be possible to induct new members, or will it just be a setting of framework for doing so?
That's a good question. I think we see already a few countries have formally lodged applications according to some of the members, but it really depends on how rapidly the BRICS member countries already want to expand, because a lot of the countries that have applied formally to join have large internal problems themselves. So say Argentina, they're going through their own economic financial crisis, and I don't think necessarily it would be hugely beneficial for BRICS to admit countries with internal problems until they can sort them out. That's why we see, say, the EU and NATO, they put on these list of preconditions before you can join, including like level of democracy and development index and things like this. So I think what would make sense to me would be more for, as you said, the framework for admission to be set. So you give countries a pathway to join the BRICS grouping in the future. Some criteria, exactly, which is agreed upon by the 5 current member states. It is possible maybe that some of the larger countries that apparently have applied could be admitted. So I think there's rumors that Saudi Arabia had looked to join.
And the UAE.
Yeah.
Yes, well, yes.
And the UAE.
Yeah.
And of course, those countries are much more stable in terms of economic situation, political situation even, than some of the other apparently applying member states, I think, such as Argentina. And I think Tunisia was also another one that they said was applying, which they are facing dire economic situation within their own country. So there's possibility maybe it will set up two things even. Like we'll have one list of countries that might be admitted, and then a second list which are candidate countries which have a framework about criteria that they must meet to be able to be admitted in the future.
Well, thank you. That was Ronan Wordsworth of Geopolitical Futures in Prague, talking to us about South Africa's difficult balancing act externally and internally. Thank you, Ronan.
Thank you very much for having me, Chris. I look forward to seeing you again in the future.